The winter of 1874 had fallen hard across the Wyoming plains, burying the land in drifts that swallowed fences and silenced the earth beneath. The wind carried knives of ice that cut through cloth and skin alike, turning every step into a battle. Clara walked with her head bent against it, her shawl wrapped tight around her baby boy. The fabric was thin, more suited to autumn than a season like this, and snow had already stiffened the edges, so it felt like she carried a bundle of ice as well as a child. Her boots were worn, her feet soaked, yet she pressed forward because behind her was nothing but hunger and fear. The boy made no sound, only a soft whimper now and then, as if he too knew silence was safer. Clara whispered to him, though her lips were cracked and her voice barely carried. She promised him warmth, though she did not know where she would find it. The town behind her had shut its doors, faces hard in the windows, hands quick to draw curtains. Whispers had followed her, a widow with no kin, a woman whose man had left and maybe still lived, a stranger with a child and no money to her name. She had knocked on doors until her knuckles bled, begging only for bread or a corner of a barn, but mercy had fled the town along with the Sunday. Now the road stretched white and endless. She thought she might collapse in the snow and never rise again. Then smoke rose faintly on the horizon, dark against the gray sky, a promise she did not trust yet could not ignore. Her breath quickened, though her body trembled with weakness. Step by step she drew closer, until the shape of a house appeared, a cabin standing stubborn against the winter, its chimney spilling warmth into the frozen air. She reached the porch and knocked once, the sound small against the roar of the wind. No one came. She knocked again, harder, her heart pounding. The door creaked open and a man filled the frame. Tall, broad, with a lantern in one hand. His face was worn with lines that spoke of years alone. His eyes gray and unreadable, like the sky above the valley. Behind him, firelight flickered, a glimpse of salvation. Clara clutched her child tighter, voice breaking as she asked only for a piece of bread, enough to keep her alive for another day. The man said nothing. His gaze shifted to the baby, then back to her face. His silence felt heavier than a spoken refusal. Her knees buckled, and she sank down onto the porch, tears hot on her frozen skin. She begged not for herself, but for her son, offering him if that was the price of saving his small life. The words shamed her, yet they came from a place deeper than pride, the place where love claws against death. The man did not move, not at first, but the firelight behind him glowed steady, waiting, and so did he. The lantern's glow spilled across the porch, throwing long shadows on the snow as Clara knelt trembling with her child. The man stood above her, still as stone, his silence as sharp as the wind that cut across the valley. She thought he would turn her away as the others had, thought the door would close and the firelight vanish. Her heart pounded with terror, not for herself, but for the boy pressed to her chest, his tiny breaths faint and uneven. Then the man shifted, not with haste but with a slow, deliberate motion, setting the lantern aside and lifting the shotgun that leaned against the wall. Clara flinched, clutching her son tighter. But instead of raising it, he slid it gently out of the way. Without a word, he unfastened the heavy coat from his shoulders, bent down, and draped it over her. The weight of it felt like a shield, wool thick with the scent of smoke and pine, holding back the cold that had already seeped into her bones. He did not meet her eyes. He simply turned and pushed the door wide, letting the warmth of the cabin spill out to her shivering body. Clara stared at the open doorway, unsure if she had strength to rise. When she staggered, the man reached for her arm, his grip rough from years of labor yet careful, steadying her without demand. He guided her across the threshold, the fire's heat washing over her face so suddenly she nearly wept. Her knees gave way, and again his arm held her firm until she found the chair by the hearth. The baby stirred weakly, a sound so small Clara thought it might vanish, but the fire's glow kissed his cheeks with the first touch of color she had seen all day. The man crouched beside the hearth, his hands practiced as he stirred the embers and laid new logs across them. The flames leapt higher, filling the cabin with light that flickered across rough wooden walls and shelves lined with jars. Clara held the child closer, tears sliding down her cheeks, though she made no sound. She wanted to thank him, but her voice broke on the words, so she simply nodded, clutching the coat he had given her. From the back room came the clink of metal, then the smell of broth. The man returned carrying a small bowl, steam curling from it in the firelight. He set it on the table without a word, then placed a folded blanket nearby, clean, though threadbare. His silence was heavy but not cruel. Clara watched him with wary eyes, wondering who he was, why he lived alone in such a place. What loss had carved the lines into his face? The baby whimpered again, softer this time, and Clara pressed her lips to his forehead. She whispered his name, a sound of love wrapped in exhaustion. The man looked at them for a long moment, his expression unreadable, then turned back to the fire. Clara knew nothing of him yet, only that he had not turned her away. That was enough. The storm deepened in the days that followed, sealing the valley in white silence. Clara woke each morning to the sound of wind clawing against the shutters and the steady rhythm of logs crackling in the fire. Her baby slept easier now, his cheeks warmed by the hearth, and his small hands twitching as though he dreamed of gentler days. She rose carefully, limbs still aching from the journey, and found the man already awake. He moved about the cabin with quiet purpose, feeding animals in the barn, carrying water from the well, mending what winter threatened to break. Clara tried to stay out of his way at first, unsure of her welcome, but silence pressed on her shoulders until she could bear it no longer. She began to sweep the floor, to gather kindling, to rinse the bowls he left on the table. He did not stop her. He did not speak, but his gaze followed her with something that was not suspicion, though it was not trust either. When she stirred the pot of thin stew one evening and set it near the fire, he took a seat without comment, and for the first time they shared a meal side by side, the sound of spoons clinking against tin, filling the gap words could not bridge. The baby brought a different kind of sound into the house. His laughter, weak at first, soon returned with strength, a bubbling joy that startled Clara with its brightness. She would rock him in the chair by the hearth, singing softly, and now and then she caught the man watching them. His eyes lingered not on her but on the child, as though he remembered another face, another voice long gone. He never smiled, but there was a softness in the way he shifted more logs into the fire when the baby fussed, or in how he placed a wooden toy horse on the quilt one evening without explanation. Clara picked it up with trembling hands, recognizing the wear of years, perhaps the hand of another child who once held it. She laid it beside her son, whispering thanks though the man gave no reply. By the third day, the silence between them no longer felt like a wall. It felt like space, something that allowed breath and rest. Clara ventured outside with him once, her skirt dragging in the snow, and watched him repair the barn latch with steady hands. She carried a pail of water back to the house, her arms shaking, but she did not falter. When she set it down, he gave her the briefest nod, the smallest acknowledgement, and it filled her with more warmth than the fire itself. At night she lay on the cot he had prepared. The baby curled close against her. The storm roared, but inside the cabin there was steadiness, the sound of his boots on the floor, the scrape of his knife against wood, the hiss of the fire. She had not expected to find safety here. Yet with each passing day, the cabin felt less like the shelter of a stranger and more like a place where life, however fragile, could take root again. The fire had burned low that night, glowing embers painting the walls with a dim red light. Clara sat close to the hearth, her baby bundled in her arms, rocking him gently while the storm howled against the shutters. The man sat at the table, carving a block of wood with slow, careful strokes, the scrape of his knife, the only sound in the cabin. They had lived in this rhythm for days, silence broken only by the needs of survival. But as Clara watched the fire shift and fade, something inside her began to stir. She had carried her story alone for too long, and the weight of it pressed harder in the quiet. She spoke softly at first, unsure if he would listen, unsure if her voice could even cross the gap between them. She told him about her husband, about the man he had once been before the war had hollowed him out. She said his name slowly, as though it burned on her tongue. He had been kind in the beginning, she said, with laughter in his eyes and a way of making her feel seen. She remembered flowers left on her windowsill, songs sung off-key at the end of long days, arms that once held her gently. But the war had taken more than his voice. It had left him with anger that grew like a fire he could not put out. Her words broke and stumbled, but she pushed on, telling of the bottle he turned to, the nights when the walls shook with his rage, and the day her child was born, when the storm outside had matched the storm inside. She whispered of the moment she saw him standing at the open door with the baby in his arms, his eyes glassy, his voice saying he could not take the crying anymore, that maybe the cold would teach silence. Her throat closed on the memory, and tears burned her eyes, but still she spoke. She told how she had run into the snow barefoot, clutching her child, not stopping until the town lights were gone behind her. The man had not moved, not even the scrape of his knife, and for a long moment she thought he had shut her words out. Then she looked up and found his eyes fixed on the fire, shadowed but not empty. She saw grief there, deep and buried, the kind that matched her own. Slowly he set the knife aside, his rough hands resting flat on the table as though bracing himself against something unseen. When he finally looked at her, there was no judgment, no suspicion, only a heaviness that spoke of his own loss. He did not tell her all of it, not then, but the silence that followed was not hollow. She saw the small boots tucked near the hearth, the wooden toy horse worn smooth by another child's hand, the patched blanket folded with care. She understood without words that death had lived here too, that this man carried memories sharp as her own. The storm rattled the shutters, but inside the cabin, two people sat in a silence that was no longer lonely. It was the silence of truths laid bare, of grief recognized, of something fragile beginning to grow in the ashes of the past. The days stretched long and cold, yet inside the cabin something small began to change. Clara found herself rising early, her baby still asleep against her chest, to stir the fire and set water to warm before the man returned from feeding the animals. She no longer felt like a guest waiting for the storm to pass, but like someone who had work to do, even if it was only sweeping the floor or folding the blankets he left by the hearth. He said little, yet his silence no longer felt sharp. It was steady, like the mountains around them, and she grew to lean on it. When she mended the tear in his sleeve one evening, her needle trembling as she worked by firelight, she did not ask if he wanted it done. She simply did it. And when he slipped the shirt back on the next day, she saw the briefest flicker of acknowledgement in his eyes. Later, when she struggled to carry the water pail from the well, he came up behind her, lifted it with one hand, and walked beside her without a word. It was not kindness spoken aloud, but it was something that reached deeper. Her child grew stronger in the warmth of the cabin, his cheeks filled with color. His cries came less from hunger and more from impatience to be held. One afternoon, Clara laid him on a quilt near the fire, while she stirred the pot of beans on the stove. She glanced over her shoulder and saw the man kneeling beside him, a rough hand hovering uncertainly before he placed a finger in the baby's small grasp. The child held tight, gurgling with laughter, and for a moment the man's face softened in a way she had not seen before. She turned back quickly, hiding her smile in the steam of the pot, afraid the moment might vanish if she looked too long. Snow piled high against the cabin walls, and still they carried on together. He taught her how to split kindling, showing her where to place the axe so the wood cracked clean. And when her hands ached from the effort, he guided her grip with patience. She taught him how to season stew with wild herbs she had once gathered, and though his face remained serious, he ate every spoonful. In the evenings, she sang low songs to her son, songs her mother had once hummed to her, and though the man never joined in, she noticed he always put another log on the fire before she began, as if making sure her voice had company. It was not a sudden thing, this closeness. It came like the slow thaw of winter, quiet and almost hidden. She found herself waiting for the sound of his boots at the door, for the steady rhythm of his work outside. He found her eyes more often, though he looked away just as quickly. Between them, silence was no longer empty, but filled with the weight of something unspoken, something that might one day be strong enough to name. The snow had begun to ease, though the cold still clung to the land like a shadow that would not lift. Clara hung the washing on a rope near the fire, the damp cloth steaming in the heat, while her child slept peacefully in the cradle the man had repaired. For the first time in many weeks, she felt her breath come easier, as though life inside the cabin had formed a rhythm she could trust. But that trust cracked one morning when a rider came up the valley trail, his horse snorting clouds into the air, his coat crusted with frost. The sound of hooves carried through the stillness, a sound that did not belong to their hidden refuge. The man stepped outside before she could rise, his rifle in hand, his broad shoulders stiff against the pale sky. Clara stood at the doorway clutching her shawl, fear prickling down her spine. The rider slowed, raised a hand in greeting, and she recognized him as one of the townsfolk she had seen when she first begged for bread. His face was set in lines of disapproval, his eyes sharp with something colder than the wind. He passed a folded paper down to the man and spoke loud enough for her to hear, saying word had come that her husband still lived, that he was looking, and that whispers in town had begun to spread like fire. He said people spoke of abandonment, of a wife who had run with a child that was not hers to keep. Then he turned his horse and left, leaving only silence and the paper trembling in the man's rough hands. Clara's knees weakened, and she sank onto the step, her child's name tumbling from her lips in a broken whisper. She had hoped the past would fade, that distance and snow would hide her from the life she had fled, but now it seemed the world would not let her go. Her mind raced with visions of her husband's face, twisted with drink and fury, his voice echoing in the night when he swore he would teach the baby silence. She pressed her hands over her ears, as though she could block it out, but fear pressed harder than any storm. The man looked at her then, his gray eyes steady but shadowed with memory. He said nothing, as was his way, but his silence carried weight. She felt his hand brush her shoulder, a brief touch, not quite comfort, not quite promise, but enough to steady her trembling. She looked up at him, tears clinging to her lashes, and whispered that she could not lose her child, not after all she had endured. His jaw tightened, and though no words came, his eyes told her he understood. That night the cabin no longer felt like simple shelter. Every sound outside carried threat. Every gust of wind seemed like hooves drawing near. Clara lay awake, holding her baby close, her heart pounding with dread. The fire burned bright, the man kept his rifle within reach, yet still the fear grew. The storm within her was not of snow or wind, but of a past that refused to die, and she knew it would find them soon. The storm returned one night, heavy snow driven across the valley, as if the sky itself wanted to bury the earth. Clara sat near the fire with her child asleep in her arms, the cabin filled with the soft crackle of wood and the steady sound of wind against the walls. The man had gone to the barn to check the stock, and she waited for the sound of his boots to return. Instead, another sound reached her, faint at first, then louder, the uneven thud of hooves on frozen ground. Her heart clenched as she rose to her feet, clutching her son close, and peered through the frosted window. A lone rider staggered in the saddle, his horse lathered with sweat, his figure hunched beneath a battered coat. She knew him before he reached the porch, even before the wind carried his voice in a ragged shout. Her husband, the man she had fled through snow and darkness. His face was pale, his eyes burning with a wild light, his hand resting heavy on the pistol at his belt. Clara backed away from the door, her knees shaking, as he roared her name, demanded she open, accused her of stealing what was his. He slammed his fist against the wood, the cabin trembling with each blow. The baby stirred, began to cry, and Clara pressed him to her chest, whispering, begging him to hush. She shoved a chair under the latch, praying it would hold. The door rattled, cracked, then burst open with a violent shove. Snow and fury swept inside as her husband stumbled through, his eyes blazing, his breath sour with whiskey. He grabbed for her wrist, snarling that she belonged to him, that the child belonged to him, that she could not hide forever. Clara cried out, twisting away, shielding her baby with her body. She fell to her knees, her shawl dragging in the snow that blew across the floor. He yanked at her, the baby screaming now, his small hands clutching at her dress. Desperation filled her, a terror deeper than the cold. Yet she would not let go. Her husband's voice rose to a howl, words broken with rage, and in that moment another sound split the night. Hoofbeats thundered up the path, fast, sure, followed by the heavy thud of boots on the porch. The man burst through the doorway, his rifle steady in his hands, his face carved from stone. He did not speak. He raised the weapon and fired, the crack shaking the walls. The bullet struck her husband in the shoulder, spinning him back with a cry of pain. The pistol clattered to the floor. Before he could reach for it again, the man kicked it aside, dragged him up, and bound his wrists with a length of leather cord. Her husband cursed, spat, fought, but the man held him as if he were nothing more than a thrashing beast. Clara clutched her baby, heart racing, tears streaming down her face as the fight ended. Snow swirled through the open doorway, but inside the cabin stood a wall stronger than any storm. The man did not look at her as he hauled the intruder outside, but she knew in that moment that he had claimed her fight as his own. The cabin was quiet after the storm of shouting and gunfire, so quiet that Clara could hear her own heart beating as she sat by the hearth with her baby pressed close. The fire had burned low, the embers glowing faintly like tired eyes. Outside came the muffled sound of hooves retreating into the night, steady and sure, carrying away the man who had haunted her steps for so long. She held her child tighter, rocking him gently until his cries softened to small hiccups, her own tears sliding down her cheeks without sound. When the door opened again, cold air swept in, and she turned quickly, fear flashing before she saw it was only him, the man of the house. Snow clung to his coat, his rifle hung loose in one hand, and his face was unreadable in the flicker of the firelight. He shut the door with a heavy thud, set the rifle aside, and crossed the floor slowly. Clara wanted to speak, to thank him, to pour out everything that filled her chest, but the words would not come. Instead, she watched as he crouched by the fire, stirring the embers until flames licked high again, his silence as steady as ever. Her child stirred, whimpering softly, and she kissed his hair, whispering comfort. When she looked up again, she found the man's gaze resting not on her but on the boy, his eyes shadowed with something that felt like memory. She saw the weariness in the lines of his face, the grief that lived behind the quiet strength, and she understood that he had fought not only for her safety, but for something within himself as well. The next morning brought a pale light across the valley, the storm easing to a hush. Clara stood at the window with her child in her arms, staring at the white world beyond. She expected fear to rise again, but instead, she felt something different, a fragile calm. The danger had not vanished, she knew, but she had seen with her own eyes that she was not alone anymore. Behind her came the sound of boots on wood. She turned to find him carrying a small bowl of broth, steam curling into the cool morning air. He set it on the table without a word, then stepped back, his hands rough and stained, his eyes meeting hers for the briefest moment, before drifting away. Later he worked outside, hammering shutters that had loosened in the storm, reinforcing the gate, moving with deliberate care. Clara watched from the porch for a while, her shawl wrapped tight, the baby sleeping against her chest. The sight of his strength brought a warmth she had not expected, a sense that perhaps the walls around her were not only of wood and stone, but of something stronger. That evening, when the baby laughed for the first time since the night of terror, the sound filled the cabin like sunlight. Clara caught the man's gaze, and for a fleeting second, she saw the faintest hint of a smile touch his lips. It was gone quickly, but it was enough. The snow began to soften under the touch of early spring, melting into small rivulets that whispered through the grass. The valley seemed less like a cage of white and more like a place waking from long slumber. But Clara's heart did not rest easy. She moved quietly about the cabin, folding what few belongings she still had, tucking them into the cloth bag she had carried the night she fled. Each stitch in her dress, each threadbare shawl folded, carried the weight of leaving. She had not spoken her intent aloud, but it lingered in every step, in the way her eyes turned often toward the door, as though measuring the road ahead. Her child slept peacefully in the cradle the man had repaired, his small breath steady, his cheeks flushed with health. Clara touched his hand softly, guilt pressing against her chest. She told herself she could not risk him losing what little safety he had found, that if her husband's kin came to claim him, the law would favor them. She imagined men on horseback riding into the valley, letters in their hands, voices sharp with judgment. They would say she had no right, that she was unfit, and her child would be taken while she stood helpless. Better to leave quietly now, she thought, before such a fate arrived. She stepped outside one evening as the sun sank low, her shawl pulled tight against the chill. The air smelled of thawing earth, and the sky burned with streaks of orange fading into gray. She looked toward the hills, imagining the road winding beyond them, harsh but certain. Her eyes filled with tears, for she knew the cabin had become more than shelter. It had become a place where silence was not cruel, where a man's steady hands had mended not only shutters and gates, but something within her own heart. Behind her came the steady thud of boots on wood. She turned quickly, startled, and saw him standing there, the man who had given her fire and bread without words, who had fought beside her without asking. His eyes fell to the bag at her feet. He said nothing, but silence spoke as loud as any question. Clara's lips parted, but her voice faltered. She wanted to tell him she was grateful, that she would never forget what he had given her, but the words tangled with fear. Instead, she looked away, ashamed of the choice she felt forced to make. He moved past her without a sound, his hand brushing the gate where a plank bore old carved letters. She saw the way his fingers lingered on the wood, the way his shoulders tightened. In that moment, she understood that leaving would not only tear her from the safety she had found, but would reopen wounds carved deep into him long ago. Her throat burned, her heart torn between flight and the fragile thread of belonging that bound her to this place. The road loomed, but so did the weight of staying, and she knew the hour of choice drew near. The night was still, the storm long gone, but Clara could not sleep. She sat near the fire with her baby resting against her chest, the flames dancing low, shadows flickering across the wooden walls. The bag she had packed lay by the door, a silent reminder of what she believed she must do. Her heart ached with the thought of leaving, yet fear pressed hard, whispering that if she stayed, her past would rise again and steal what she loved most. The door creaked, and she looked up to see him enter from the porch. His coat hung heavy with dew, his shoulders broad in the firelight. He set his rifle by the wall and lingered, his eyes falling on the bag before shifting to her face. For a long moment he said nothing, only stood there, his silence as steady as the ground beneath them. Clara's breath caught, shame burning in her throat. She whispered that she could not stay, that danger would follow, that men would come with words written on paper and claim what was hers. Her voice broke as she begged him to understand, though part of her hoped he would not. He stepped closer, his boots sounding firm against the floor, and for the first time his silence gave way. His voice was low and rough, as though unused for years, but it carried strength. He told her he had lost once before, had watched death take what was dearest, and he would not stand by while it happened again. He said the law might send letters, men might come, but they would not pass through him. Clara stared at him, tears rising, unable to speak as the weight of his words settled in her chest. She told him then, in a voice trembling but clear, that she was afraid of loving again, afraid that trusting him would end in more loss. She said she had nothing to give, no land, no money, only her child and a heart worn thin by sorrow. He met her gaze, gray eyes steady, and said that was enough. The firelight caught in the lines of his face, and she saw not only grief there, but a strength she had leaned on without asking. Clara's knees weakened, and she sank into the chair, clutching her child close. He moved to her side, kneeling so his eyes were level with hers. He did not reach for her, but his presence filled the space like a vow. She whispered that she wanted to stay, that though fear still gnawed at her, she no longer wished to run. The moments stretched between them, fragile and certain all at once. The fire cracked, the baby stirred, and Clara felt the weight of choice lift from her shoulders. It was not a promise of ease, not a promise of safety without struggle, but it was a promise of standing together. She looked at him through tears and nodded, her heart answering before her lips could. And in his quiet eyes she saw the truth: home was no longer the road ahead, it was here. The valley woke gently with the first signs of spring, the snow sinking back into the ground and leaving dark earth soft and damp beneath the Sunday. The air carried a sweetness it had not held for months, the scent of pine rising from the hills and the hint of water rushing as streams broke free from ice. Clara stood on the porch with her child resting against her chest, the shawl tucked close, her eyes following the stretch of fields where green had begun to show. She breathed deeply, feeling for the first time in what seemed a lifetime that the world was not pressing against her, but opening. He came out from the barn, sleeves rolled, his arms marked by the work of fence building and wood cutting. In his hand he carried a small piece of wood, smoothed and carved with uneven letters. He set it on the gatepost, hammering it firm, and when he stepped back, Clara could see the words clear in the sunlight. Home at last. Her throat tightened, her hand brushing her child's hair, for it was not a grand sign, not polished, but it was true in a way nothing else had ever been. The boy came running from the cabin, his laughter ringing through the air as he bounded across the yard. He went straight to Clara, flinging his arms around her waist without hesitation, and she bent down to hold him close, her tears slipping unchecked. Her baby stirred, let out a small coo, and the older child grinned wide, reaching to stroke the tiny hand. Clara saw the bond there, forming as naturally as the thawing of snow into stream, and her heart swelled until it felt too big for her chest. The man walked toward them, his step slow but sure, his eyes steady as they found hers. He did not speak, yet his silence carried more weight than words. It was in his gaze, in the way his shoulders eased when he looked at her, in the way he let his hand rest lightly on her arm. She answered with a small nod, a smile trembling on her lips, for she understood that choice had already been made, not with one moment, but with every quiet act he had given. They sat together that evening on the porch steps as the sun bled gold across the land, the sky wide and forgiving. The fire inside the cabin glowed behind them. The sound of children's voices filled the air, and for the first time, Clara felt not fear, not weight, but peace. It was not the end of hardship, for the frontier never allowed such things, but it was the beginning of something stronger. She looked out across the valley, her hand brushing against his, and whispered that they had survived. His silence, warm and steady, was all the answer she needed. If this story touched your heart, if you believe in love that grows even in the hardest winters, I invite you to subscribe to Western Love Legends, like this tale, and share your thoughts in the comments. Every week we bring you more stories where hope rises out of silence and love finds its place on the frontier. Until next time, may your coffee be hot, your boots dry, and your neighbors less nosy than Clara's once were.